Welcome to Philosophy in a Nutshell. It's Classics Unraveled, but we're doing something a little different with it. You know who also likes to take something and do something a little different with it? The Romans. That's right, ladies and gents. Today we are covering Roman philosophy. The difficulty of jumping from the land of the Greeks to the land of the Romans, philosophically speaking, is twofold. One, of course, when we have the later Hellenic philosophers, those post-Socratics we talked about before, Rome is already becoming a thing at this point. But there's not a lot going on in Rome philosophically in the 3rd or 4th century BC. It's only long after Greece has kind of stopped being a thing that Roman philosophy is going to take off. So there's a gap we need to negotiate. And two, there's the fact that the Romans themselves did not do a lot of distinct innovation in the realm of philosophy. Now, I know that's going to make some of you angry, and that is intentional on my part, but it's not like we can really say something like Aurelian philosophy or Ciceronian philosophy and point to a specific Roman philosopher and say that they've done something truly unique and different. Those philosophers are themselves students of pre-existing philosophical schools. It's mostly going to be a game of compiling and rehashing and essentially championing forms of philosophy that came from the Greeks to the Romans. So I hope you're ready for a quiz, because we're going to do a lot of review in the next few minutes. We need to talk about some of the schools that have become popular in the Roman world. But first, a very brief aside to explain how we have made our way to Rome. Remember that the Hellenic world, the kind of latter days of Greek philosophy, are occurring contemporaneously with Alexander the Great, which again is sort of Greece ceasing to be Greek. Again, Greekness spreading beyond the borders of traditional Greece out into the West and into the East, and bringing Greek ideas and institutions with them. Now, Rome was never part of Alexander's empire, and there was never a time where Greece exerted any military or political power over Rome itself. In fact, it was the opposite. It was in the 2nd and 1st centuries that Rome conquered Greece. But as is often the case in history, the conquered end up influencing the conquerors, because the excellence and the thoroughness of the academic discipline in Greece could not help but catch on in the Roman world. Now, it took a while for Romans to sort of adjust themselves to this thing. Famously, Roman individuals, especially Roman senators and politicians, would rail against the Hellenization, the Greekification of the Roman spirit, which had heretofore been largely military and all about strength and courage, and not those airy ideas of metaphysics and discourse. That isn't to say that there was no Greek influence prior to that conquest. Southern Italy was largely colonized by Greeks. They even called it in Rome Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. At any rate, Greekness has made its way to the Italian peninsula by many roads, and it's here to stay. Now, time to review. The 3 most influential schools of philosophy to make their way from Greece to Rome would be the Platonic school, or more specifically, the academic school. Remember, back in our previous video, we said that the philosophy of Plato's Academy in Athens has taken on a distinctly skeptical character. Remember, hard skepticism, what we call Pyrrhonism or Pyrrhonistic skepticism, is the suspension of belief, the realization that all of our observations, all of our beliefs are based on the imperfect tool that is human sense experience, and therefore we can only ever know things imperfectly. Now, the Platonists, or rather the academic skeptics, didn't take it that far. The academic skeptic simply says that we can't know anything surely, but we can arrive at the most logical conclusion, or the most reasonable conclusion. A sort of concession to our imperfection, but still seeking the most virtuous way forward, which is not the Pyrrhonistic suspension from such judgments. The other two are the famous pair, the famous yin and yang, those being Epicureanism and Stoicism. Of the two, Stoicism is going to be the more popular, and it's going to have the stronger proponents. However, we do need to know about both in order for what's about to happen to make much sense. The Stoics, remember, are those who believe that the world is, generally speaking, a place of suffering and imperfection and confusion, and that the path to happiness is the cultivation of personal virtue, that by possessing virtue, one is more fully human, and thereby becomes more perfectly happy, regardless of the experiences one has. If one is in possession of courage and temperance and prudence and all that, that means that they are, again, happy. They are self-sufficient in and of themselves, regardless of what's going on around them. The Epicureans, meanwhile, tried to solve the same problem, the imperfection, the suffering of man, not by saying that virtue makes you self-sufficient, but that virtue gives you the sort of life where you can become self-sufficient. Again, they're largely concerned with the material world and how a better man is more capable of surviving and thriving in the material world. The Roman philosophers we'll discuss here are largely heroes and champions of these existing philosophical schools. At least they're going to be recording or reinterpreting these philosophies to be a little more palatable to a Roman tongue. If they are innovating, it'll be to try and find how these virtues and how the cultivation thereof agrees with the pre-existing Roman virtues of courage and self-sacrifice and of obedience to the state. If you had to ask me, and you're here, so you do, then I would say the most important philosopher of the Romans would be Cicero. Marcus Tullius Cicero, or Cicero, was a Roman senator right at the end of the Roman Republic. Cicero was a bit of a polymath. He was interested in a great deal of things. The first of these, of course, would be that he was a senator. He was a consul, even. He was a paragon and ideal of the Roman political class. He famously stopped a coup d'etat in its tracks, a coup against the Roman Republic started by a fellow named Catiline. He exposed the crime, he sent him into exile, and he prevented the Roman Republic from ever being brought under the rule of a single man. Beyond these things, however, he was a philosopher, specifically a philosopher of the academic skeptic school. Most of his works can be thought of as sort of Roman adaptations of the works of Plato. Some of them even have the same titles as the works of Plato, but changed so that they, one, update Platonic ideas into the relatively more modern academic skeptic version of those thoughts, but also to adapt them for the context of the Roman state, the Roman ideas of divinity, and so forth. Perhaps his most famous work, and the one that derives from one of Plato's most famous works, would be Cicero's Republic. Just like Plato's Republic, Cicero's Republic is presented as a Socratic dialogue, a philosophical conversation between friends. Now, the friends in this book are mostly names you haven't heard of, with the exception of a certain Scipio. This is not the famous Scipio Africanus, the one who was responsible for the victory in the Second Punic War, but rather Scipio Africanus's grandson, Scipio Aemilianus, who was responsible, amongst other things, for the victory in the Third Punic War. A little hard to keep track of, huh? Scipio and company find themselves discussing Roman politics at a time where Roman politics are perhaps at their height. The Punic Wars are over, their age-long enemy is defeated, and the Roman Republic has yet to fall into the difficult and trying times that the author, Cicero himself, finds himself trying to save. It's in this context that Scipio, the mouthpiece for Cicero, tries identifying what the ideal republic is. Just like Plato before, what is the ideal state? But whereas Plato's Republic used the ideal state as a means to an end to try and identify what justice, formal justice, really was, Cicero is actually interested in what the ideal state looks like. Is Rome the ideal state? And for that matter, is Cicero's Rome the ideal state? Or is Scipio's Rome the ideal state? Or some other Rome the ideal state? And what attributes must the ideal state have to earn that title? As an aside, if you're thinking, this sounds a lot less like the metaphysics that we've been discussing before, and a lot more like political philosophy, you're right. This is a work of political philosophy. Hear me out. Through these characters, Cicero identifies a sort of spectrum on which every civilization falls in terms of how political decisions are made. On one end, you have the decisions of the many, or the decisions of all. In other words, democracy, where every single member of a state is capable of governing that state. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have the decision of one, the decision of a king or a tyrant or of a single individual given all the power to make those decisions. Cicero has taken Plato's account of different states and streamlined it into a matter of how many people are in charge, the many or the few. And there are pros and cons to both sides of that spectrum. On one hand, power of many allows everyone to have a say. It means that the government will genuinely represent the will and the desires of the people being governed, because they're governing themselves. However, what decisions that many makes ends up relying a lot on the wisdom and the virtue of that population. If you have a population that is 51% evil or 51% unwise, then by and large, the decisions that country is going to make are going to be bad. Whereas, if your decisions are made by one man, by a king, and that man happens to be a wise and virtuous leader, then you're not going to have that sort of aggregating effect of going to the lowest common denominator. A wise king will be a wise ruler, and your decisions will largely be good. Now you could say that a bad king and an unwise king would therefore be a bad ruler, and you're absolutely right. If the possibility of an evil king is not enough to make this look questionable, there's also the matter that the will of the people, the desire of the governed to be governed a particular way, is eliminated in the case of a monarch, because a monarch gets what he wants. Perhaps he'll be afraid, perhaps he will be swayed by public opinion in terms of desiring to keep his status quo, desiring to preserve the safety of his position, but ultimately, he's the one that calls the shots, and so the will of the people does not get nearly as much respect in a power of one system. In the middle of these two binary extremes, we have, I suppose, the rule of the few. Now, this is a fairly attractive proposition, because on one hand, a group of people is still going to better represent the will of the many than just one individual ruler, a king. And for that matter, having just a few people also offers that sort of selectivity of a limited rulership. The idea that people are being selected on some basis of excellence instead of just by virtue of having a pulse. So theoretically, this council, or this senate, if you will be based on who is being chosen, who is being selected on the basis of their merits, on the basis of their desert for the position. If for any reason there is a bad senator, at least it's not an absolute monarch where there's no instrument of removing that person. At least there are other members of this council or senate who are capable of doing something about the occasional bad egg. However, this system is not without its flaws either. As soon as you have a representative politics, there's going to be some, party politics. There's going to be some jockeying for favor, currying up votes, that sort of thing. And there always is the risk that people will be making those selective decisions not on the basis of merit, but on the basis of their own personal advantage. So each of these systems, the rule by many, the rule by one, the rule by few, they all have pros, they all have cons. Which is the best? Which system is the one that maximally gives people the ability to have their voices heard, but also maximally reduces the possibility of risk? Which system is the ideal republic? In true academic skeptical fashion, Cicero does not choose one of them. I know he's not a purinistic skeptic. I don't mean that he doesn't choose. He doesn't choose one of them. What I mean is that he chooses a mixed system, a system where all three modes of government are represented by a single state. The many select their few, the few are beholden to the one, but the one can be vetoed by the few, and the few can be voted in or out by the many. Cicero is the first person to philosophically articulate the idea of checks and balances. And if you've ever heard of that idea that the founding fathers founded the American Republic on the bases and tenets of Roman law, it was really not so much on the Roman Republic as it was, but the Roman Republic as Cicero envisioned it, a place where checks and balances were present to prevent power from falling too squarely in the hands of the one. So we have this tool, this instrument of governance, the state, the ideal state that combined features the checks and balances. It's great. For what? What is government for? What is the state for? Is just managing people a good in and of itself, or does a state exist as a means to an end? Here is where Cicero pulls us back from the relatively applied world of political philosophy to the fundamentals of metaphysics, the nature of man. Remember, the Romans are preoccupied with the idea of state, with the idea of the republic. But most of what's come before is largely about individuals, about man. So here's where Cicero begins to tie those together and answer, what does government, what does a republic have to do with its members? In Cicero's The Laws, as well as his Republic, he tries to distinguish between natural law and civic law, public law. Natural law would be, according to Cicero, those fundamental laws, those ordering principles of the universe itself that make the world and make man the way they are. This should strike us as very familiar to the forms of Plato or the causes of Aristotle, the things that make things what they are, the laws that make man, man. Cicero thought that natural laws, these fundamental rules of what we can do and what we can't do to our fellow man, were so obvious, were so transparent that anyone could access them, and that you didn't need to be a Roman, you did not need to be a part of Roman civilization to access these laws. Now, if you are Roman, you do have Roman law, and the Romans did think that the civic law of Rome was superior to that of the laws of, for example, other nations. So there is something good, and there is something special about the laws of a civilized state. But civic law is just layers built on top of a foundation, that natural law. You can have natural law without those layers built on, but you can't have it the other way around. Those civic laws need to be based on natural law in order for them to be any good. So the job of the philosopher is to distinguish between those natural and civic laws, to look and find the ones that are merely human invention, that are not built on anything substantial, and dispose of them. So, what is this natural law that Cicero is trying to tell us? Is there some set of commandments that the Roman or the good man is supposed to follow? No, Cicero does not give us such a tablet. He's not concerned with a specific set of laws as much as he is with a lodestar, a guiding star to orient all of our actions, all of our decisions in a specific direction. That's not going to be served by a rule book telling us everything to do in every single situation. As before, with Aristotle, with Plato, we're talking about virtue. We're talking about the orientation towards right decision-making in every context. In other words, virtue itself is natural law. And in the terms of the state, the good state is that which orients all human action towards virtue. Cicero suggests that the excellence of the Romans, their rise from humble origins to become masters of the world, is evidence in itself that the laws of the Roman people has led them to virtue, and therefore that the Roman laws, while imperfect, while possessed of various human inventions and so forth, is indeed the closest thing we have to a human articulation of natural law. Again, he doesn't identify the real thing. He doesn't identify a set of commandments for the Roman people. But he's an academic skeptic, after all. He isn't sure of the fundamental things. He is simply trying to find the closest truth, the most rational course to follow. And so we shouldn't be disappointed in old Cicero that he's not going to give us those tablets. Instead, we should praise him for having found a good path to take, a good model to follow. Perhaps not the best, but the best one that Cicero in his time could find. There is so much more we could say about Cicero. We really should have just made a Cicero video, but we're not. There's so much more we could say about Cicero's teachings. He talks about obligations. He says that those of us who are good, those of us who are virtuous, have a burden on our shoulders to act virtuously. He talks about friendship. He talks about why certain people are more deserving of our beneficial action than others. But we're not going to talk about those things because, as important as Cicero was, he was an academic skeptic, and academic skepticism is not the main philosophical trend in the Roman world. That would be Stoicism. Seneca the Younger was a Stoic, which is not a very specific endorsement to the fellow, but that's basically what he was. He was a pretty normal, run-of-the-mill, everyday Stoic philosopher whose contribution was that he brought Stoicism and a very practical and kind of approachable version of Stoicism to a Roman audience. He wrote a lot of letters and a couple of books that, instead of dealing with Stoicism in this very abstract cultivation of virtue kind of way, addressed specific human harms and specific human anxieties and tried to answer them in Stoic terms. For example, he wrote on the shortness of human life, where he advocates against the squandering of our time in favor of using our time deliberately and in pursuit of things that actually matter. He writes on how to guard against unnecessary anger, to be constant in one's habits and in one's speech. He is basically writing a sort of lesson book for just how to do the Stoic thing day by day. Seneca basically wrote the Stoicism 101, where everyday Romans could access these Stoic ideas to approach a life of virtue for its own sake. It's probably why so many Romans became Stoics in the first place, because Seneca gave them such an easy on-ramp to these ideas. So it's no surprise that about 100 years later, this finally makes its way up to the very top of the Roman Empire at this point, in the hands of the most famous Roman Stoic, Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is a person worth talking about for a lot of reasons besides being a Stoic philosopher. If you'd like to hear about that, then go ahead and click the link. Was that good? Yeah? We will turn to his Meditations, a book which is essentially a diary, a philosophical diary. It's addressed to himself, and to my knowledge, I don't think he even meant it to be published. At any rate, we have it, so we're going to talk about it. It's worth reading for two very strong reasons. One is that he's among the first Romans to really add something significant to Stoic philosophy. For example, he suggests the cultivation of virtue not only for its own sake, but outside of the public view. This is unusual in a Roman context. There's no sense of virtuous humility in Roman terms. So the idea that you would deliberately hide your righteousness, you'd commit righteous actions outside of the public eye, is, well, very un-Roman. And yet Marcus Aurelius promotes it on the basis that being observed might actually corrupt the nature of your righteousness, that it might create an ulterior motive, a perverse incentive to steer your behavior one way or another. Being unobserved is itself a virtue. Being unobserved allows you to commit actions on one basis alone, and that's whether it's right or wrong. He reflects, as Cicero does, on the subject of obligation, on how the best thing we can be is not merely a good man, but a man having done the good, that the fulfillment of obligation is something that cannot be taken away from us, even if things should change in the future. And like Seneca, he reflects on the brevity of our life and looks at humanity, looks at a person as a part of nature, a nature that he considers fundamentally good in and of itself. Whereas Seneca says that man is the measure of all things, that we comprehend the good outside of us by first measuring the good within us. Marcus Aurelius says that it is by nature, by good nature, that we're able to identify what is good for us. After all, nature keeps on going long before we're born and long after we're dead. And so the good of the world around us is more intrinsic, more eternal than those individual contributions we make to the total good. The most important thing that Marcus Aurelius adds to the Stoic tradition is a distinction within the fundamental language of Stoicism itself. Recall that the Stoics cultivated virtue for its own sake, that instead of seeking happiness, they cultivated virtue, and that virtue itself was happiness, right? Well, Marcus Aurelius says that, depending on how we think of happiness, that may not be true. If we think of happiness as the sensation of happiness, whether we're talking about the emotion of happiness, or even just the sense that I've done the right thing, the sense of fulfillment or accomplishment or satisfaction, if that's what we mean by happiness, then he says not even that can be counted on as the product of virtue. That virtue itself is happiness. Again, happiness does not come with it. Happiness is it. And anything that we call happiness that is not the virtue itself is not the same thing. What this means is that one can be a perfect Stoic philosopher and cultivate a life of perfect virtue without ever tasting the fruits of that experience, without ever experiencing the happiness or the satisfaction that one would expect of a perfect life. This might not sound like a great thing, but it means that we mustn't take the experience of suffering as a failure. One might and even must continue to suffer in his lifetime, and one might never feel fully confident in whether they are doing the right thing. However, as long as one knows what virtue is, and one can point to it in their own lives, one can say that they are still doing the right thing. This is important because it goes directly against something that Cicero said before. Remember how Cicero said that he believed in the righteousness of the Roman people because of the evidence of Rome's own success? Marcus Aurelius is suggesting that the fruits of our efforts are not necessarily indications of the righteousness of our having earned them. We mustn't make the judgment of virtue on the basis of success or satisfaction or anything except for the virtue itself. I said ages ago that there are 2 reasons to read Marcus Aurelius. The other is because his meditations are beautiful. I hope you'll indulge me for a little while. Every moment think steadily as a Roman and a man to do what thou hast in hand with perfect and simple dignity, and feeling of affection and freedom and justice, and to give thyself relief from all other thoughts. And thou wilt give thyself relief, if thou dost every act of life as if it were thy last, laying aside all carelessness and passionate aversion from the commands of reason, and all hypocrisy and self-love and discontent with the portion which has been given to thee. Thou seest how few the things are, the which if a man lays hold of, he is able to live a life which flows in quiet, and is like the existence of the gods. A lot of the things that Marcus Aurelius has told us, the practice of virtue outside of the public eye, the separation of the experience of happiness from the satisfaction of virtue, all of these things are going to have a lot in common with Christian teaching. And this is going to be a touchstone in the 2nd century where early Christian philosophers begin talking to the Romans and having something in common. And it is to those Christian philosophers we shall turn in the next episode. In the meantime, please drop a like in the like jar and subscribe if you haven't done so already. I am John Christensen. Fare thee well.